In southeastern Turkey, deep under the plains of Diyarbakir, archaeologists found a room, a staircase, a low ceiling, an altar. On the back wall, barely visible, a young man stabbing a bull through the neck. This is a Mithraeum, the temple of a Roman mystery cult so secret that even today, nobody is completely sure what they did down there. And it sits inside a Roman fortress called Zerzevan, the last outpost before the Persian frontier. Built on a ridge nobody could explain why the Romans cared so much about. For years, people studied Zerzevan as a Roman story, a military story, a story about an empire's edge. It isn't. Zerzevan sits on a ridge in southeastern Anatolia, 13 kilometers south of the modern town of Chinar. To the east stretches the Tigris Basin. To the west, the long road back to Antioch in the Mediterranean. It's exactly where you'd put a fortress if you were Rome and you were worried about Persia. Roman troops manned this position from the 3rd century AD onward, and by the 4th century, it was a major eastern garrison. The Sasanian Persians were on the rise. Border raids were constant. Caravans needed protection, so Rome built walls, towers, cisterns. A small city designed for one job: hold the line. And it worked, for centuries. Zerzevan stayed garrisoned through the rise and fall of dynasties, Roman, then Byzantine, until it was abandoned in the 7th century when the Arab conquest pushed the frontier somewhere else entirely. When archaeologists began serious excavation in 2014, they expected what you'd expect: barracks, a bathhouse, officer quarters, a church from the late Christian period. They got all of it. They also got an underground rock-cut church, a residence with frescoes, a network of tunnels, and then they opened a door they weren't expecting. A staircase sealed for nearly 1,500 years led them down into a Mithras temple, untouched since the day the Romans walked away. The cult of Mithras was a men-only mystery religion that spread through the Roman army between the 1st and 4th centuries AD. Soldiers loved it, officers loved it, and almost nothing was written down, because the whole point was that you weren't supposed to talk about what happened inside. What we know is fragmentary. There were 7 grades of initiation. There was a sacred meal. There was a bull. The central image in every Mithraeum on earth is the god Mithras stabbing a bull through the neck while a scorpion attacks its testicles and a dog laps the blood. It's a death image, built into the foundations of Roman military culture. So here's the question everyone asks about Zerzevan. Why here? Why did the Romans build a Mithras temple this far east of the empire on this exact ridge? Why dig down through the bedrock to make a room to kill a bull in the dark? The official answer is logistics. It's defensible. It controls a road. It's the right distance from the next garrison. But there's another answer that nobody talks about. About 130 kilometers north of Zerzevan, there's a low hill that nobody noticed for thousands of years. Its name is Başur Höyük. It sits in what's now Siirt province, right where a tributary feeds the Tigris. Archaeologists started digging it in 2007. By 2017, they had uncovered something so disturbing that the team kept publishing about it. In 2018 and 2020, again in 2024, trying to find language for what they were finding. They settled on a phrase: radical death practices. Picture this. You're standing on this hill around 3100 BC. The late Uruk world to the south is fragmenting. Cities are emptying. New peoples are pushing down from the highlands. Power across the whole region is up for grabs. In Başur Höyük, 2 children, 12 years old, are buried in a stone-built tomb with thousands of objects: bronze weapons, beads in the tens of thousands, royal seals. They might have been royal, they might have been religious. They were buried with an adult, and with thousands of pieces of wealth, and the bones don't tell us who they were. What is certain is who else was buried at their feet: 8 adolescents, between 11 and 20 years old, laid out at the foot of the central tomb. Their bodies show what archaeologists call perimortem trauma, wounds that happened right at the moment of death. Arrowheads embedded in bones, sharp force trauma to the skull. Several were killed with deliberate blows to the head. None of them were elderly. None of them were sick. They were healthy young people who, at the moment a powerful child died, were killed and placed at the foot of the tomb to accompany them into the afterlife. The team, led by bioarchaeologist Brenna Hassett at the Natural History Museum in London and archaeologist Haluk Salam Timur at Ege University, was very careful in their wording. They didn't call it human sacrifice in the headline. They called it radical death practices. But the implication is hard to escape. In a region with no earlier evidence of this kind of mass retainer burial, suddenly, at the exact moment that the first cities are collapsing and the world is reshaping, a hill in southeastern Anatolia produces a tomb where adolescents were killed to accompany dead children into the afterlife. And then it happened again. The team kept publishing. More burials, more young bodies, more arrowheads and bones. The pattern wasn't a single horrifying event. It was a practice, a custom, something they did on this hill more than once. Brenna Hassett said it bluntly. The pattern at Başur Höyük is unlike anything else in the region at this period. The people who did this were doing something new, something they invented, something so striking that the archaeologists, 3,000 years later, still don't have a clean language for it. The closest parallel, distantly, is the famous death pits of Ur in southern Mesopotamia. But those came later, and Ur is 600 kilometers south. Whatever started at Başur Höyük didn't stay there. The pattern surfaces again in this corner of Anatolia. Different sites, different centuries. The intensity drops, the customs change. But ritual violence around elite burials never fully disappears from this landscape. And then, in the 3rd century AD, Rome arrives. Here's what I want you to hold in your head. The Romans picked this region for one of the easternmost Mithras temples in the empire. The land they pick is, archaeologically, one of the most documented landscapes of ritual death in pre-classical Anatolia. Did the Romans know? Almost certainly not, in any direct way. The Bronze Age tombs at Başur Höyük had been buried for over 3,000 years when the first Roman boot touched the Zerzevan Ridge. The names of the people who killed those adolescents were lost long before Rome existed. But places have a kind of memory that isn't archaeology. When Rome arrived, this corner of southeastern Anatolia had been continuously inhabited for over 5,000 years. The locals had stories. The locals had places they avoided. The locals had old gods who, by then, had been folded into newer gods, who had been folded into newer gods again. The bull-slaying god the Romans built their temple around, Mithras, shared a name with an old Persian deity. But scholars now think the Roman cult was largely its own invention, a Roman thing, even if the name traveled with it. It's possible, and this is speculative, but it's where the evidence keeps pointing, that the Romans chose this ridge because the land already had a reputation for being a place where the gods accepted death, a reputation that started in some form with people we will never name, on a hill 130 kilometers north at the dawn of the Bronze Age. When the excavators at Zerzevan opened that staircase, they thought they were uncovering a Roman story. They were, but underneath it, layered down through the soil, 1,500 years of Roman, 3,000 years of Bronze Age, 5,000 years of people doing things on this land that we can barely interpret, is a much older question. Why does the same patch of ground, generation after generation, end up being the place where humans decided to kill someone else in the dark and call it sacred? This isn't unique to Zerzevan. Jerusalem's Temple Mount was sacred to Canaanites before the Israelites. The Hagia Sophia was a pagan temple before it was a church, before it was a mosque. Rome's St. Peter's stands on a pagan burial ground. The most powerful religious sites on earth all began as someone else's. And whoever built those built them on places older still. We just don't know how far back the chain goes. Today, Zerzevan is on the UNESCO Tentative List. Tourists walk through the Mithraeum and photograph the bull. 130 kilometers north, the excavation at Başur Höyük continues every summer. And every summer they find more bodies, some of them children. We assume when we look at the ancient world that the past was simpler, that ritual killing was a single phase, a barbaric stage that civilization moved through and left behind. Başur Höyük tells us it didn't even start that way. It was an invention, a new idea. Someone on that hill in 3100 BC looked at a powerful dead child and decided to put 8 teenagers in the ground with them. And it worked well enough that the practice spread, mutated, traveled, and survived in distant forms long enough that Roman soldiers, 3,000 years later, would gather in a dark room 130 kilometers south and kill a bull together to feel close to a god. The land remembered, the people forgot. If you want to see what happened to the Bronze Age world that started all this, the cities that fell, the people who scattered, the centuries of collapse that turned ritual into legend, the full story is right here.